So in the last couple of days, we've seen two head coaching changes in the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
One involving the Toronto Raptors' former head coach, Nick Nurse, and one involving their former assistant, Adrian Griffin, who gets the Milwaukee job.
Mm-hmm.
That always interests me when coaches from one team who is turning everything upside down wind up going to other teams. And I don't know. Do you think Griffin got a serious look in Toronto?
That's a good question. I'm not sure he did. And if he did, what is the goal of what Masai and Bobby Webster are trying to do? Are they trying to change a bit of the culture with this team? I mean, we haven't heard very much from the basketball team at all.
Really.
About what's going on, who's being hired. We've heard lots of rumors. Steve Nash is at the top of the list again.
He's at the top of the list for people on the outside looking in.
Right.
Whether he's at the top of the list for the Raptors or not, I doubt it.
No, I'm just talking about, people using scuttlebutt.
Yeah, right.
He's first of all, we all know his name. I mean, that's one of the reasons.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I think it speaks to the culture that from a coaching staff that Nick Nurse has created here, or had created here when some of his assistants do get opportunities to coach. Don't you?
Well, I think it's curious that the head coach gets fired, and then one of his assistants gets a head coach someplace else, and so does Nurse himself, who goes to Philadelphia, and that'll be an interesting situation because Nurse and Embiid have been at each other several times over the years.
Yep.
Given those playoff situations, Embiid has said some very unkind things about Nurse.
In the heat of the battle, though.
I get that. But now they have to work together. And is Embiid going to be willing to do what Nurse tells him to do? Or is he going to be a contrarian, looking for him to get out? And, this is the MVP of basketball now. Embiid. One wonders if he has the kind of power that other superstars have, where if they say, I don't like the coach, you get a new coach.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was pretty evident with Doc Rivers' demise, don't you? I think that was one of the things that happened in Philadelphia, that the players...
Maybe, yeah.
So I'd have to hope and think that in hiring Nurse, that there was some sort of discussion with Embiid and maybe even Harden.
You have to think there would be, wouldn't you?
Sure. I mean, look what's, and not to derail the conversation, we can certainly talk about the Sixers and Nurse, but look what's happening in Pittsburgh. I mean, Sidney Crosby's as actively involved in discussions with potentially new presidents of hockey operations and general managers as anybody. He's meeting people in Carolina. He's meeting people in Pittsburgh. He and Kyle Dubas spent a couple of days together last week.
That's sort of what I mean.
John, but I'd have to think that Embiid has been part of this. I mean, I think the pendulum has swung so pro player with A, the money they're making, and B, the contracts they have, that you have to involve them. This is, these two leagues, particularly, I think hockey and basketball, have become such players' leagues now because of the contracts. And you have to make sure, and I think the psychology of coaching, the psychology of managing has changed so much. It is maybe to the chagrin of a few people, but I think in 2023 you have to be a motivator as much as you have to be a tactician in order to try to get your team. And the way you motivate is to make sure that it looks like the player's idea more than anything else.
I may be wrong, but I would not be at all surprised if there are coaching announcements this week, because, the hockey season, especially in the NHL, doesn't resume until Saturday.
Right.
And one knows that it's not a rule by any stretch of the imagination, but it's sort of been a thing that you don't make a coaching decision or a front office decision while the finals are on.
Yeah. And NBA starts Thursday. NBA starts Thursday, so that's probably a discussion point in that league as well. And then you're right. With the Stanley Cup final starting on Saturday, I would not be surprised to see some announcements, even even beyond the obvious ones, like in Pittsburgh, to Spencer Carberry's rumored to be the new coach in Washington. Whether the Caps want to do that announcement before Saturday makes a ton of sense to me.
Well, that's another interesting one. Here's a former Maple Leaf guy.
Yeah.
Was he interviewed for the Leaf job?
Well, they don't have an opening yet for coach. There's still a coach of the Maple Leafs, Bob. Dare I remind you that Sheldon Keefe is still the coach?
I get that. But would they, here's a guy who's being interviewed for a head coaching job. Wouldn't you want to talk to him?
I think you're waiting for the new manager to come in and decide whether Sheldon is going to be your man or not.
Both the Raptors and the Maple Leafs better get on that, don't you think? Especially the Raptors. They've been waiting a long time.
A long time. I know. It's almost out of sight, out of mind, isn't it? They've been so quiet.
Is. And you wonder, how many interviews are you going to give for a head coaching job?
Yeah.
And does it do anything more than confuse you as to who the best candidate is? I would think you'd interview 3 or 4 guys, and those would be the guys that you think are the best qualified. Those are the guys you talk to, and you make a decision for that. When you get into 10 or 12 interviews, I think it becomes nothing but confusing. Either that or you haven't found anybody you think is any good.
I do. But I think there's some mitigating circumstances. For instance, a guy that was at the top of a lot of people's list was Monty Williams, who got fired in Phoenix after the playoffs. But Monty Williams is owed $20 million by the Suns.
Right.
So let's say he interviews for the Raptor job, and Masai and Bobby and the board, because remember the board's involved, the board like him. And so now how do you find a way to get around the $20 million, which is to say, hey, Monty, we'll pay you, we'll give you the Nick Nurse dollars. We'll give you $8 million. So that's $8 million over 4 years. And Monty's going to say, well, hold on. I'm going to get $20 million
to do nothing.
To do nothing. I'm going to get $20 million. So now most of these guys, as we touched on yesterday with Eric and Scott, most of these guys want to get back into the heat of the battle, correct? They all love it. This is a drug to them, coaching and managing. So, but the motivation you have to wonder what the motivation is, particularly at this time. Remember, Masai's making a sizable amount. Nick Nurse, they're still having to pay $8 million this year, although that'll get mitigated by the Sixer job. They maybe they don't have to pay Nick anything after he signs his deal in Philly. But as well as I do that people are going to start looking at $12 million for Masai, $8 million for Nick. Brendan's making 6 or 7.
So answer me something. Could the Raptors do a deal with Phoenix and say, okay, Williams is owed $20 million. We'll give him 10 of that, but you give him the other 10.
Well, that usually what happens, and I can only speak for what happens in hockey, but I assume the NBA is comparable, is the league office in the end would mediate and say, do you want the job? Usually it's of a longer term so that there's a reason for the guy to take the job. So if that's the case, then perhaps there's a way to say, we're going to pay you $5 million a year for the first 3 years, and then we'll pay you $10 million for year 4, which means he gets an extension of another year, and then Phoenix is on the hook. But the league would have to approve that deal. If the Raptors couldn't come in and say, Monty, we're going to pay $1 million. What they would tell you is that it would probably have to be at least 50%, if not a bit more, Bob, in order to try to make sure that Phoenix is being treated fairly and not being taken advantage of by a new team. But I'm sorry, I just can't imagine, with all the histrionics that went on around the Masai contract, with all the histrionics went around that of firing Nick, and he was making $8 million. I can't imagine this board being very happy to sign somebody and pay them that much money. And I wonder if that's an issue right now. I really do.